The conference room at Naval Special Warfare Command buzzed with quiet conversations as officers filed in for the monthly briefing. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen adjusted her uniform and checked her notes one final time. At 28, she was the youngest person in the room and one of only 3 women present. Her compact frame and quiet demeanor often led people to underestimate her, something she had grown accustomed to throughout her military career. The meeting was supposed to discuss new training protocols and equipment upgrades for various units. Sarah had been invited because of her expertise in psychological warfare and interrogation techniques, skills she had developed during her 4 years as a military intelligence officer before transitioning to special operations support. As she took her seat near the back of the room, she noticed several SEAL team members clustered around the coffee station. Their conversation was loud enough for most of the room to hear, though they seemed oblivious to their volume. The topic, predictably, centered on their recent deployment and various war stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison dominated the conversation. At 35, he was a 15-year veteran with multiple deployments under his belt. His broad shoulders and weathered face told the story of countless missions, and he carried himself with the confidence that came from surviving situations most people could never imagine. His reputation within the community was solid, though some questioned whether his ego had grown larger than his actual accomplishments. Sarah opened her laptop and reviewed her presentation materials. She had been asked to brief the group on new psychological assessment techniques that could help identify potential security risks during overseas operations. The research was groundbreaking, combining traditional interrogation methods with modern psychological profiling to create more effective screening processes. The room gradually filled with more personnel. Sarah recognized most faces, having worked with various units over the past 2 years. Some nodded in acknowledgement, while others seemed surprised to see her there. The special operations community was still adjusting to increased female participation, and reactions varied widely depending on individual attitudes and experiences. Captain Rodriguez entered and called the meeting to order. The first hour covered routine administrative matters and operational updates from recent deployments. Sarah listened carefully, taking notes on details that might be relevant to her own work. The psychological aspects of military operations fascinated her, particularly how stress and isolation affected decision-making in high-pressure situations. When Captain Rodriguez announced the next agenda item, Sarah felt her stomach tighten slightly. She had given presentations to senior officers before, but this group included some of the most elite warriors in the military. Their respect had to be earned, not given, and she understood that her credibility would be judged not just on her knowledge but on how she presented herself. Jake Morrison and his teammates took seats in the middle of the room, directly in Sarah's line of sight. She noticed them whispering among themselves and occasionally glancing in her direction. Their body language suggested skepticism, if not outright dismissal. This was not unusual. She had faced similar attitudes throughout her career and had learned to use doubt as motivation rather than discouragement. As Captain Rodriguez introduced her, Sarah gathered her materials and moved to the front of the room. She connected her laptop to the projection system and pulled up her first slide. The presentation title appeared on the screen: Advanced Psychological Profiling in High-Stress Environments, New Techniques for Operator Safety and Mission Success. She began with a brief overview of current screening methods, explaining how traditional approaches sometimes missed subtle psychological indicators that could predict behavior under extreme stress. The room remained attentive, though she could sense varying levels of engagement. Some officers leaned forward, clearly interested in the technical aspects, while others seemed to be going through the motions of polite attention. 10 minutes into her presentation, Sarah was explaining the correlation between certain personality traits and performance in isolation scenarios when Jake Morrison raised his hand. She paused, expecting a technical question about the research methodology or practical applications. Instead, Jake stood up slightly in his chair and said loudly enough for the entire room to hear, "Ma'am, with all due respect, how exactly does someone who has never been in a real firefight know what goes through an operator's mind when bullets start flying?" The room fell silent. Every conversation stopped, and all attention focused on the exchange developing between the experienced SEAL and the intelligence officer. Sarah felt the weight of 30 pairs of eyes studying her reaction. This was the moment she had anticipated and prepared for, though it still sent adrenaline coursing through her system. Jake continued, his voice carrying a hint of condescension that made several officers shift uncomfortably in their seats. I mean, you have got some impressive degrees and certifications, but have you ever actually been downrange? Have you ever had to make life or death decisions with incomplete information while someone is shooting at you? A few of Jake's teammates nodded in agreement, though most of the room remained neutral, waiting to see how Sarah would respond. Captain Rodriguez started to intervene, but Sarah raised her hand slightly to indicate she could handle the situation herself. She looked directly at Jake, her expression calm and professional. Chief Morrison, that is an excellent question, and one that gets to the heart of why this research is so important. Her voice carried clearly through the room without any hint of defensiveness or anger. Jake seemed surprised by her measured response. He had expected either an angry reaction or a deflection that would prove his point about her inexperience. Instead, Sarah continued with the same professional tone she had maintained throughout the presentation. You are absolutely right that combat experience provides insights that cannot be gained from textbooks or controlled studies, she said. That is exactly why this research focuses on collecting data from operators like yourself who have been in those situations. The goal is not to replace your experience and judgment, but to help identify potential problems before they reach the battlefield. Jake was not satisfied with her diplomatic response. He pressed further, his voice gaining an edge that made some of the senior officers frown. That sounds nice in theory, but when push comes to shove, what matters is whether someone can perform when everything goes wrong. No amount of psychological testing can replace actual experience under fire. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. You make a valid point about the importance of combat experience. However, I would suggest that psychological preparation and understanding can significantly impact how someone responds to that first experience under fire, and every experience after that. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. But, since you brought up the importance of combat experience, perhaps I should provide some context for my own background before we continue with the technical aspects of this research. Jake leaned back in his chair, clearly expecting her to admit that her experience was limited to training exercises and academic study. Several other team members smiled slightly, anticipating what they assumed would be a confirmation of their skepticism about her credibility. Sarah walked to the center of the room, no longer referring to her notes or slides. Her demeanor remained professional, but something in her posture suggested that the dynamic of the conversation was about to shift dramatically. Chief Morrison, you asked about my combat experience, she said, her voice steady and clear. That is a fair question, and one that deserves a complete answer. The room seemed to hold its breath as Sarah prepared to respond to Jake's challenge. Even Captain Rodriguez, who had Sarah's complete service record, leaned forward slightly in anticipation of what she might reveal. Sarah's calm confidence in the face of Jake's aggressive questioning had already begun to shift the room's energy. Some officers who had initially seemed sympathetic to Jake's skepticism now appeared more curious about what Sarah might say next. The tension was palpable as she prepared to address his assumptions about her background and qualifications. Jake Morrison sat back in his chair, confident that he had cornered the intelligence officer into admitting her lack of real-world combat experience. His expression suggested satisfaction with how he had challenged her credibility in front of the room full of special operations personnel. What happened next would change the entire atmosphere of the meeting and leave Jake Morrison questioning his assumptions about the quiet officer who had just been trying to share her research. Sarah Chen was about to reveal information that would not only answer his question but demonstrate that judging people by their appearance and position could be a dangerous mistake, even for experienced special operations personnel. The silence stretched for several seconds as Sarah gathered her thoughts. When she finally spoke, her words would transform the dynamic of the room and provide a lesson in the importance of not making assumptions about people based on limited information. Everyone in the room waited to hear what the young intelligence officer would say in response to the SEAL's direct challenge to her credibility and experience. The next few minutes would prove that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected sources, and that wisdom and experience can be found in places where they are least expected. Sarah took a deep breath and looked directly at Jake Morrison. The room remained completely silent, with every person present focused on her response to his challenge about combat experience. Her calm demeanor had not changed, but there was something different in her eyes now, a depth that suggested she was about to share something significant. "Chief Morrison, you asked about my combat experience," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Before I became an intelligence officer, I served as a combat medic with the 75th Ranger Regiment for 3 years. During that time, I participated in 47 combat missions across Afghanistan and Iraq." Jake's confident expression began to waver slightly. Combat medics with the Rangers were not desk personnel, they were frontline operators who faced the same dangers as the infantry soldiers they supported. His assumptions about her background were already proving incorrect, but Sarah was just getting started. "During my second deployment to Afghanistan, my unit was conducting a village clearance operation in Helmand province when we came under sustained enemy fire from multiple positions," Sarah continued. "Our squad leader was hit in the first few minutes, along with 2 other team members. I found myself treating casualties under direct fire while also helping coordinate our response to the ambush." The room remained completely silent. Several officers who had served in similar situations nodded slightly, recognizing the scenario Sarah described. Combat medics often found themselves in impossible situations, trying to save lives while bullets flew around them. Jake Morrison's face had gone pale. As an experienced SEAL, he understood exactly what Sarah was describing. Village clearances were among the most dangerous operations in Afghanistan, and combat medics were prime targets for enemy fighters who understood that removing medical support could devastate unit morale and effectiveness. Sarah continued her account with the same professional tone she had maintained throughout the meeting. "The firefight lasted approximately 4 hours. During that time, I treated 7 wounded personnel, including performing emergency surgery on our team leader who had taken shrapnel to his abdomen. We had no immediate helicopter evacuation available due to weather conditions, so I had to keep him alive using only the supplies in my medical kit." Captain Rodriguez, who had Sarah's service record in front of him, knew what she was describing was accurate, but hearing it presented in this context was powerful even for him. The other officers in the room were beginning to understand that their assumptions about the quiet intelligence officer had been completely wrong. The surgery had to be performed in a partially collapsed building while enemy forces continued to probe our perimeter, Sarah said. "I had 2 soldiers providing security while I worked, but we could hear gunfire throughout the entire procedure. The patient was conscious for most of it because I could not spare the anesthesia. We had other wounded personnel who might need it." Jake Morrison looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. His earlier swagger had completely evaporated as Sarah methodically dismantled his assumptions about her experience and qualifications. Several of his teammates were staring at him with expressions that ranged from embarrassment to disappointment. Sarah's presentation was not meant to humiliate Jake, but rather to illustrate why assumptions could be dangerous in their line of work. She continued with her account, providing enough detail to establish credibility without sensationalizing the events. When helicopter evacuation finally became available 8 hours later, all 7 wounded personnel were alive and stable enough for transport, she said. The team leader I had operated on made a full recovery and returned to duty 6 months later. He actually recommended me for the Bronze Star with Valor for my actions during that engagement. The mention of the Bronze Star with Valor sent a ripple through the room. This was not a medal given lightly, it required extraordinary heroism under direct enemy fire. Several senior officers exchanged glances, clearly impressed by the revelation of Sarah's combat record. But Sarah was not finished. She had made her point about combat experience, but she wanted to tie it back to the importance of the psychological research she had been presenting when Jake interrupted her. "Chief Morrison, you asked about understanding what goes through an operator's mind when bullets start flying," she said, her voice taking on a slightly different tone. "During that engagement, I learned something important about psychological preparation and stress response that directly relates to the research I was presenting." Jake nodded mutely, no longer in any position to challenge her credibility or question her understanding of combat stress. The entire room waited to hear what lesson she had learned from her experience under fire. "While I was performing surgery on my team leader, I realized that my hands were completely steady despite the gunfire and chaos around us," Sarah explained. Later, I wondered why I had been able to function so effectively when other equally trained medics might have struggled in the same situation. She walked back toward her laptop, preparing to return to her presentation slides. That experience sparked my interest in psychological preparation and stress inoculation training. I wanted to understand what factors allowed some people to perform effectively under extreme stress while others struggled. The connection between her combat experience and her current research was becoming clear to everyone in the room. This was not an academic exercise for Sarah, it was a practical application of lessons learned from real-world experience. I spent the remainder of my time with the Rangers studying stress response and interviewing other medics and soldiers about their experiences during firefights, she continued. What I found was that certain psychological preparation techniques could significantly improve performance under stress, regardless of previous experience. Captain Rodriguez leaned forward, clearly interested in where Sarah was heading with her explanation. Other officers throughout the room showed similar engagement as they began to understand the practical applications of her research. That research led to my transition into intelligence work, where I could study these phenomena more systematically and develop training protocols that could benefit other operators, Sarah explained. The psychological profiling techniques I was presenting today grew directly out of questions I had about my own performance and observations of my teammates during combat. Jake Morrison finally found his voice, though it came out much quieter than his earlier challenges. "Ma'am, I apologize for questioning your background without knowing the full story. I should not have made assumptions about your experience." Sarah turned to face him directly. "Chief Morrison, your questions were actually helpful because they highlight exactly why this research is important. In our line of work, we constantly make assessments about people based on limited information. Sometimes those assessments are accurate, and sometimes they are dangerously wrong." She gestured toward the projection screen, where her presentation slides were still visible. "The psychological profiling techniques I am researching are designed to help us make better assessments about people's capabilities and potential vulnerabilities, whether we are evaluating our own team members or trying to understand potential threats." The room's energy had completely transformed. What had begun as a skeptical challenge to an intelligence officer's credibility had evolved into a powerful demonstration of why psychological preparation and accurate assessment were crucial for special operations personnel. Sarah returned to her position at the front of the room, ready to continue with the technical aspects of her presentation. But the dynamic had fundamentally changed. Instead of having to prove her credibility to a skeptical audience, she now had the complete attention of officers who understood that she was speaking from both academic knowledge and hard-earned experience. Jake Morrison's teammates were looking at him with expressions that made clear they thought his earlier behavior had been inappropriate and embarrassing. The SEAL community prided itself on professionalism and respect for proven operators, regardless of their current position or appearance. Captain Rodriguez decided to address the situation directly before allowing Sarah to continue. "Lieutenant Commander Chin, thank you for sharing that background. I think it provides important context for the research you are presenting. Please continue with your briefing." Sarah nodded and clicked to the next slide in her presentation. "Now that we have established the practical foundation for this research, let me show you some specific techniques that have proven effective in predicting performance under stress." As she began explaining the technical aspects of psychological profiling, the room's attention was complete and focused. Officers took detailed notes and asked thoughtful questions about implementation and training applications. The skepticism that had characterized the beginning of the meeting had been replaced by genuine interest in learning from someone who had proven herself both in combat and in academic research. Jake Morrison sat quietly throughout the remainder of the presentation, occasionally taking notes but mostly listening with the focused attention of someone who had learned an important lesson about making assumptions. His earlier confidence had been replaced by a more humble recognition that experience and wisdom could be found in unexpected places. The transformation in the room's atmosphere demonstrated the power of authentic experience combined with professional expertise. Sarah had not only answered Jake's challenge about her combat credentials but had used the opportunity to illustrate the very psychological principles she was trying to teach. Her calm, professional response under pressure had been a practical demonstration of the stress inoculation training she advocated for other operators. As Sarah continued her presentation, the room's energy remained focused and engaged. The revelation of her combat background had fundamentally changed how the assembled officers viewed both her and the research she was presenting. Questions came frequently, but they were now substantive inquiries about methodology and practical applications rather than challenges to her credibility. Lieutenant Commander Martinez from SEAL Team 3 raised his hand during a discussion of stress inoculation protocols. "Ma'am, you mentioned that psychological preparation could improve performance regardless of previous experience. Can you elaborate on how that might work for operators who already have extensive combat experience?" Sarah nodded, clearly pleased with the quality of the question. "Excellent point, Commander Martinez. The research shows that even highly experienced operators can benefit from specific psychological preparation techniques because combat stress affects different people in different ways, and those effects can change over time." She clicked to a new slide that showed brain scan images highlighting different areas of neural activity during stress responses. "What we have found is that repeated exposure to combat stress can actually change how the brain processes threat information. Sometimes these changes are beneficial, creating faster response times and better situational awareness. But sometimes they can create problems." Jake Morrison found himself genuinely interested in the discussion despite his embarrassment over his earlier behavior. As a 15-year veteran with multiple deployments, he had noticed changes in his own stress responses over time but had never understood the neurological basis for what he was experiencing. Sarah continued her explanation while displaying charts that showed the relationship between deployment history and various psychological markers. For example, operators with extensive combat experience sometimes develop hypervigilance that serves them well in dangerous situations but creates problems during routine activities. Understanding these patterns can help us develop training protocols that maintain operational effectiveness while preventing long-term psychological damage. Captain Williams from the Naval Special Warfare Development Group leaned forward in his chair. "Are you suggesting that combat experience could actually be detrimental in some situations?" "Not detrimental, but potentially misaligned with mission requirements," Sarah clarified. "An operator whose brain has adapted to constant threat assessment might struggle with missions that require blending into civilian populations or building rapport with local contacts. The hypervigilance that keeps them alive in firefights could make them appear threatening or suspicious in social situations." This was exactly the kind of practical insight that special operations commanders needed to hear. The men in the room were beginning to understand that Sarah's research could help them become more effective operators while protecting their long-term mental health. Major Thompson from Marine Special Operations Command asked the next question. "How do you test for these psychological adaptations without compromising operational security or making operators feel like they are being evaluated for fitness for duty?" Sarah smiled, recognizing the concern behind the question. "That is one of the key challenges we faced in developing these protocols. Nobody wants to feel like they are being psychologically evaluated every time they report for duty. The techniques we developed are embedded within routine training exercises and mission planning sessions." She advanced to a slide showing a training scenario layout. "For example, we can assess stress response patterns and decision-making processes during realistic training exercises without operators knowing they are being evaluated. The data we collect helps us identify potential issues and develop individualized training programs to address them." Jake Morrison raised his hand for the first time since his earlier confrontation with Sarah. When she acknowledged him, he spoke more quietly than before. "Ma'am, how do you prevent this kind of psychological profiling from becoming a tool that commanders use to remove operators from active duty?" Sarah appreciated the question because it showed that Jake was thinking seriously about the practical implications of the research. "Chief Morrison, that concern was actually the primary focus of our protocol development. The goal is never to remove effective operators from duty, but rather to help them become even more effective while protecting their long-term well-being." She explained how the psychological profiling system was designed with multiple safeguards to prevent misuse. All assessment data is confidential and focused on training recommendations rather than fitness evaluations. Commanders receive information about how to optimize team performance and individual training, not recommendations about who should or should not remain on active duty. The discussion continued for another 30 minutes, with officers asking detailed questions about implementation timelines, resource requirements, and integration with existing training programs. Sarah answered each question thoroughly, drawing on both her research experience and her practical understanding of special operations culture. As the formal presentation concluded, Captain Rodriguez stood to address the room.
Lieutenant Commander Chen, this has been an outstanding briefing. I think everyone here can see the value of this research and its potential applications for our units.
He looked around the room, making eye contact with several officers. I want each team leader to consider how these protocols might be integrated into your training programs.
Lieutenant Commander Chen will be available for follow-up discussions with anyone interested in participating in the pilot implementation program. As officers began filing out of the room, several approached Sarah to ask additional questions or express interest in collaborating on the research.
The enthusiasm was genuine, representing a significant shift from the skepticism that had characterized the beginning of the meeting. Jake Morrison remained in his seat as the room emptied, clearly wrestling with how to address his earlier behavior. Sarah noticed his hesitation and approached him as she packed up her materials. "Chief Morrison, did you have additional questions about the research?" she asked in the same professional tone she had maintained throughout the presentation. Jake stood up and looked directly at her.
"Ma'am, I owe you an apology. My behavior earlier was unprofessional and inappropriate.
I made assumptions about your background and qualifications without knowing anything about your actual experience." Sarah set down her laptop bag and gave Jake her full attention. "Chief Morrison, I appreciate the apology, but I want you to understand that your questions actually helped make the presentation more effective. When you challenged my credentials, it gave me an opportunity to explain why this research is personally important to me."
Jake seemed surprised by her response.
He had expected either continued coolness or a lecture about making assumptions.
Instead, Sarah was treating his earlier behavior as a learning opportunity for both of them.
"The truth is, your reaction is exactly what we see in operational environments," Sarah continued.
"Operators constantly make rapid assessments about people based on limited information. Sometimes those assessments are accurate, and sometimes they are not.
Understanding how and why we make those judgments is part of what this research addresses." She gestured toward the door where other officers were still leaving. "Every person in this room made assumptions about me when I walked in. Some assumed I was inexperienced because of my age and current position. Others might have assumed I was highly qualified because I was invited to brief a group of senior officers.
Both sets of assumptions were based on incomplete information."
Jake nodded slowly, beginning to understand the broader implications of what Sarah was explaining. "You are saying that the same psychological processes that led me to question your background could affect how we assess threats or allies in operational environments."
"Exactly," Sarah confirmed.
"Understanding our own cognitive biases and the factors that influence our judgment can make us more effective operators and leaders.
That is why this research focuses on practical applications rather than abstract theory."
The conversation continued for several more minutes as Jake asked thoughtful questions about the psychological factors that influenced decision-making under stress. His earlier hostility had been replaced by genuine curiosity about how he could improve his own performance and better lead his team. As they talked, Sarah realized that Jake's initial challenge had actually been valuable for reasons beyond what she had mentioned. His aggressive questioning had forced her to articulate the practical value of her research in terms that special operations personnel could understand and appreciate. "Chief Morrison, I have a proposition for you," Sarah said as their conversation began to wind down. "Your team's experience and your willingness to ask hard questions would be valuable assets for the pilot implementation program.
Would you be interested in working with us to test these protocols with your unit?" Jake's expression showed surprise and genuine interest. "After how I acted earlier, you would want my team involved in your research?"
Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the conference room. "Chief Morrison, your team's skepticism and your willingness to voice that skepticism makes you ideal test subjects. We need operators who will challenge the protocols and push back against anything that does not make practical sense. The offer represented more than just professional collaboration, it was an acknowledgement that Jake's earlier behavior, while inappropriate, had come from legitimate concerns about operational effectiveness and the welfare of his teammates.
Jake extended his hand to Sarah.
"Ma'am, I would be honored to have my team participate in your research program.
And thank you for handling my earlier behavior with such professionalism.
I learned something important today about making assumptions." As they shook hands, both understood that the interaction had been transformative for reasons that extended beyond the specific research being discussed. The lesson about not judging people based on appearance or position was one that applied to every aspect of their dangerous and complex work. The meeting had ended very differently than anyone in the room had anticipated when it began. What started as a routine briefing had become a powerful demonstration of the importance of keeping an open mind and avoiding assumptions, even for experienced special operations personnel who prided themselves on their ability to read people and situations accurately. 3 months after the memorable briefing, Jake Morrison found himself in Afghanistan, leading his SEAL team on a complex reconnaissance mission in the mountains near the Pakistani border. The mission required his team to work closely with Army intelligence personnel, including a young female officer who had been assigned as their liaison for psychological operations support. As Jake studied the mission briefings, he could not help but remember his encounter with Sarah Chen and the lesson he had learned about making assumptions. The intelligence officer assigned to his team was Lieutenant Rebecca Torres, a recent graduate from the Defense Intelligence Agency's Advanced Training Program. On paper, she looked like exactly the kind of person Jake might have dismissed 3 months earlier, young, inexperienced, and lacking obvious combat credentials. But Jake's experience with Sarah had taught him to look beyond surface appearances. Instead of making assumptions about Lieutenant Torres's capabilities, he scheduled a private meeting to discuss her background and understand how she could best contribute to the mission's success. During their conversation, Jake learned that Lieutenant Torres had grown up in a border town in Texas, spoke fluent Pashto and Arabic, and had spent 2 years working with refugee populations before joining the military. Her understanding of Afghan culture and psychology was extensive, even if her combat experience was limited.
More importantly, Jake found himself asking the kinds of questions that Sarah's research had suggested were important. How did Lieutenant Torres respond to stress? What was her decision-making process when faced with incomplete information? How did she handle situations where her recommendations were challenged or ignored? The answers revealed someone who was thoughtful, adaptable, and remarkably calm under pressure. Jake realized that his old approach would have focused primarily on her lack of combat experience and missed the valuable skills she brought to the team. The mission itself proved challenging in ways that highlighted the importance of psychological preparation and cultural understanding. Jake's team was tasked with identifying and establishing contact with local tribal leaders who might provide intelligence about Taliban movement in the region. Success required not just military expertise but also sophisticated understanding of local politics and social dynamics. During the 3rd day of the mission, Lieutenant Torres identified a pattern in local behavior that suggested the team was being observed by hostile forces. Her analysis was based not on technical intelligence but on subtle changes in how villagers interacted with each other and with the American personnel. The psychological indicators she noted were invisible to the experienced SEALs, who were focused on traditional security concerns. Jake's initial impulse was to question her assessment. The tactical situation appeared normal, and his team had not detected any obvious threats. But, remembering his experience with Sarah Chen, he decided to take Lieutenant Torres's concerns seriously and adjust the mission plan to account for her observations. The decision proved crucial. Within hours of changing their patrol routes based on Lieutenant Torres's psychological assessment of local behavior, the team discovered evidence of a planned ambush along their original path. The intelligence officer's understanding of cultural psychology had potentially saved lives and ensured mission success. That evening, as Jake filed his mission report, he reflected on how much his leadership approach had changed since the meeting with Sarah Chen. He found himself paying more attention to the psychological aspects of leadership and team dynamics, recognizing that technical expertise alone was not sufficient for complex modern operations. Jake also began implementing some of the stress inoculation training techniques that Sarah had discussed in her presentation.
During training exercises, he paid attention to how different team members responded to various types of pressure and adjusted his leadership style accordingly. The results were noticeable improvements in team performance and cohesion. 6 months after returning from deployment, Jake received an invitation to participate in an advanced leadership development program at the Naval Postgraduate School. The curriculum included courses on psychological leadership, cultural intelligence, and adaptive decision-making under uncertainty.
Jake recognized these topics as direct applications of the research Sarah Chen had been conducting.
During the leadership program, Jake had the opportunity to present his own research on the psychological factors that contributed to successful special operations missions. His presentation drew heavily on lessons learned from his interaction with Sarah Chen and his subsequent experiences working with Lieutenant Torres in Afghanistan. The audience for Jake's presentation included senior officers from all branches of the military, many of whom were grappling with similar questions about how to identify and develop effective leaders in an increasingly complex operational environment. His combination of practical experience and newfound appreciation for psychological research made his insights particularly valuable. During the question and answer session following his presentation, a Navy captain asked Jake to describe the most important leadership lesson he had learned in recent years. Jake's answer surprised many in the audience who knew his reputation as a hard-charging, technically focused operator. "The most important lesson I learned is that my assumptions about people are often wrong, and those wrong assumptions can be dangerous," Jake said. "I used to think that leadership was primarily about technical expertise and combat experience. Now I understand that psychological insight and cultural intelligence are equally important, especially for the complex missions we face today." He went on to describe his encounter with Sarah Chen, acknowledging his initial skepticism and explaining how her combination of combat experience and academic research had changed his perspective on leadership and team development. "Lieutenant Commander Chen taught me that wisdom and experience can be found in unexpected places," Jake concluded. "More importantly, she showed me that the psychological skills I thought were secondary to technical expertise are actually fundamental to everything we do in special operations." After completing the leadership program, Jake was promoted to Senior Chief Petty Officer and assigned as the Senior Enlisted Advisor for a new Special Operations training program. His role involved helping to develop psychological preparation protocols for operators preparing for deployment to complex operational environments. The training program incorporated many of the techniques that Sarah Chen had researched, including stress inoculation training, cultural intelligence development, and adaptive leadership under uncertainty. Jake found himself working directly with Sarah on several aspects of the curriculum, a collaboration that would have seemed impossible during their first meeting. Their professional relationship had evolved into mutual respect based on shared commitment to improving operator effectiveness and safety. Sarah appreciated Jake's practical insights and his ability to translate psychological concepts into language that operators could understand and apply. Jake valued Sarah's research expertise and her unique perspective as someone who had experienced combat stress firsthand. The success of their collaborative training program led to its adoption by other special operations units throughout the military. The psychological preparation techniques they developed were credited with improving mission success rates and reducing psychological casualties among deployed personnel. 3 years after their first confrontational meeting, Jake Morrison and Sarah Chen were invited to co-present their research at the annual Special Operations Research Conference. Their presentation, titled Beyond Technical Expertise, The Psychology of Adaptive Leadership in Complex Operations, was attended by senior leaders from throughout the special operations community. The presentation began with Jake describing his initial skepticism about psychological research and his assumptions about Sarah's qualifications. He used their story as an example of how cognitive biases could affect operational decision-making and explained how changing his perspective had made him a more effective leader. Sarah followed by presenting the technical aspects of their research, demonstrating how psychological preparation could be integrated into existing training programs without compromising operational security or creating additional administrative burden for units preparing for deployment. The combined presentation was powerful because it demonstrated both the practical value of psychological research and the importance of overcoming assumptions about people and ideas. Their collaboration had produced tangible improvements in operator performance while illustrating broader lessons about leadership and teamwork. During the final question and answer session, a young Marine officer asked Jake whether he regretted his initial confrontation with Sarah at that first meeting. Jake's answer reflected the wisdom he had gained from the experience. "I regret the unprofessional way I expressed my skepticism, but I do not regret asking hard questions about the practical value of the research," Jake said. "The difference is that now I ask those questions with curiosity and respect rather than assumptions and hostility. Lieutenant Commander Chen taught me that challenging ideas is important, but challenging people based on incomplete information is counterproductive and potentially dangerous." The lesson resonated throughout the special operations community, where the ability to make rapid, accurate assessments of people and situations was literally a matter of life and death. Jake Morrison's transformation from skeptic to advocate demonstrated that even experienced leaders could learn to overcome their biases and become more effective through psychological awareness and cultural intelligence. The story of Jake Morrison and Sarah Chin became a case study used in leadership development programs throughout the military, illustrating the importance of keeping an open mind and avoiding assumptions even when dealing with topics or people outside one's direct experience. Their collaboration proved that the combination of practical experience and academic research could produce insights more valuable than either approach alone. Most importantly, their story demonstrated that the psychological skills often dismissed as secondary to technical expertise were actually fundamental to success in modern special operations. The lesson that Jake learned in that conference room about not judging people based on appearance or position had applications far beyond military settings, but its impact on special operations effectiveness was measurable and significant. The transformation in Jake's leadership approach and his successful collaboration with Sarah Chen provided a model for how experienced operators could integrate psychological awareness into their professional development without compromising their commitment to operational excellence. Their story proved that wisdom and effectiveness could be found in the willingness to challenge one's own assumptions and remain open to learning from unexpected sources.